Welcome, Peter and Judith, and welcome to everyone watching at home or your office from around the world. Welcome to a series of video interviews from the TAP network, where we'll look to speak to and learn from colleagues within the TAP network, working on a range of issues related to SDG 16+ and accountability for the 2030 agenda. Especially in today's times with the COVID-19 pandemic affecting all of our individual lives and the work that we do together. And of course, with social distancing guidelines and a shift towards more virtual engagement amongst peers and partners, we're trying to find new ways to engage with and learn from our colleagues and partners, and that's more important than ever before. So we hope that these video interviews will be a helpful tool and a resource to be able to share and learn from our counterparts that work on all of these issues all around the world and in many contexts. So with that, I'll introduce Peter van Sluijs and Judith Kaulem. Both of them are co-chairs of the TAP Network Steering Committee. So welcome, Peter and Judith.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I'll start just with giving you the opportunity to give a brief background and overview of the work that your organization does. And if you can also tell us a little bit about what motivated you to become part of the TAP Steering Committee. So maybe Judith, we'll start with you.
Thanks, John. I work with an organization called the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust in Zimbabwe. We are into policy advocacy, which is our primary work, but it's informed by research. So we really do work that influences policy so that it's pro-people, pro-poor all across here. And what motivated me really, my first interaction with the TAP network was during the Partners for Review meeting in Uganda. And John, you were there, and that time you were publicizing the production of the accountability handbook. And when I listened to it, I was like, this is the thing. I need to know more about this. I need to be part of this. And since then, we have never regretted it. And then the opportunity came for us to be on the steering committee, and here we are. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Judith. Yes, so we, on a personal level, go back a few years now at least. So great. Thanks,
yes,
Judith.
Yeah.
So Peter, tell us a little bit about CSPPS and the work that you do.
Thank you, John, and great to be on this call with you. My name is Peter van Sluijs. I'm a senior strategist working with Coordinate, a development organization based in the Netherlands, but I'm acting as steering group chair, co-chair, in my capacity of coordinating the civil society platform for peace building and state building. And that is a platform that tries to coordinate local civil society organizations, predominantly peace building oriented organizations in fragile and conflict affected settings, in their engagement with the governments, but also donor representatives. We work through the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building, to which CSPPS is the civil society arm of that body. And SDG 16 is front and central to the work we are doing, given the importance it places on striving towards peaceful, just and inclusive societies. So that as a brief introduction. John, over to you.
Great, yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. And of course, we've worked really closely with CSPPS prior to this as well around the Rome Declaration. Peter, you were one of the co-chairs of that process to develop the Rome Declaration. So our work with CSPPS goes back a few years now as well.
And if I could just add back as well, John, can I add about the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, that with regards to the SDGs, we are really, we are coordinating in Apex organizations in Zimbabwe under the reference group, the Zimbabwe Civil Society Reference Group on SDGs. So we are really key in pushing the SDG work as the coordinator of that forum. And we work closely with government in that regard as well, yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Judith. And yeah, I mean, that's a great point too. I think the wealth of knowledge and experience that your organizations bring to the network and the steering committee. I mean, both of you work at the national level with your partners and coordinate networks and partners at the national level, but also have the global experience as well. So I think there's a lot to be said about, I mean, especially these days, about connecting what happens at the local level to the conversations happening at the global level. And, you know, I think that'll be in particular focus next week at the 2020 HLPF. But we'll touch on that in just a little bit as well.
Just a little add-on, John. I mean, I realize that I mean, the motivation indeed to join the TAP steering committee is also based on the earlier working relationship we have established with the TAP network, of course, but also the realization that coordination of efforts and bringing together various networks is of key importance to further that agenda. So it's also within that vein, I think, that we have decided to indeed join the steering committee, but also actively seek that coordination and alignment between various civil society actors, because I think in joining hands in that sense makes civil society work better together, but also be a stronger voice in the arenas where we need to be heard. So,
yep, I think it's a great point. And actually, speaking of which, I mean, I was going to ask you both a question about, you know, how can we come together around some common messaging? I mean, there's a lot to be said around TAP's advocacy, but you know, advocacy on so many levels. There's this constant question about messaging and how do we sell the work that we do to partners that, you know, they may be working on some of the same issues, but may not necessarily know about our organizations or networks or about the opportunities we have for collaboration. So I was going to ask you both, related to the work that TAP does and related to the work that you do around the SDGs, if you had one message to sell your work and to sell the SDG agenda and SDG 16, what would that message be, whether it's to governments or civil society or to citizens themselves? What's the main takeaway of this agenda for you and the added value and the selling point for you? Maybe we'll start with Judith.
Actually, for me, I think the key principle of leave no one behind speaks to the major importance of the SDGs. So unlike the MDGs, which probably left half of the people in poverty and all that, now the universality of the SDGs for me is really key. And if we appreciate that we need to leave no one behind, it means we need to appreciate what is happening in each and every country on the continent with each and every individual. And for us to do that, we cannot do that in silos then. We need, when we appreciate that and bring it together under platforms like the TAP network, because I think it's a credible platform that then draws all the different experiences from the members who are across the globe. And then we put that into a message that speaks, because the SDGs for me just speak to humanity, to our everyday life. So if we were to really fulfill the 17 SDGs, we would have touched on everybody's well-being. So I think it's important that we appreciate that and we strengthen our platforms like the TAP network and many others that I appreciate are also available to many civil society organizations and bring people together. I appreciate that as the TAP network, had it not been for the COVID-19, there have been so many efforts to really strengthen the capacity of civil society organizations at the local level. So that strengthening for me ensures that the civil society working on the ground are able to start messaging in a manner that speaks to many levels, to their own local level, to the global level, to the UN itself. And then we are able to channel that and bring it together as one unit.
Great, thanks, Judith. Yeah, and Peter, what are your messages?
Yeah, well, I mean, Judith made very strong points, but to add on, I think, I mean, the agenda for sustainable development is of key importance for the entire world. And it's also unique that for the first time, I think, the leaders of the world have agreed on an agenda which is universal. So it's not only helping certain countries which are at risk or which are lagging behind in their development process, but it's a universal agenda which also acknowledges and notifies that many of the issues the world is facing today are interlinked. And the interlinkages and the complexity of those interlinkages is something we need to challenge and address, all of us together. I mean, it's not one single country which can solve these issues by themselves. But in fact, it needs a global effort, it needs a universal effort, but it also needs a multi-stakeholder effort to address some of those challenges and the complexities the world is faced with. And I think in that vein, I think leaving no one behind is the guiding principle, is the important segue to actually make progress, is to reach the furthest first. Because with that, you will reach the entire agenda if you are able to make that point happen. So I fully second what Judith said before. But I think the universality of the agenda and the fact that everybody is tasked with making progress on the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development is of key importance here.
Great, yeah, and I completely agree with both of you. I think especially when in today's times where, yeah, I think some of the countries that were champions of SDG 16, for example, during the negotiation process, I think what we've learned over the past few years, at least, since the adoption of the SDGs, is that I think no country is immune or in a special circumstance when it comes to being a champion when it comes to SDG 16. I think in particular around issues like governance and peace and justice and fundamental freedoms, I think even the best countries that we would consider to be really great in the implementation of all of these things may have their own issues. And I think the people-centered focus of the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda, it's central to everything. It underpins efforts towards every other issue and every other need of people in different countries and locations. So, great.
And John, you know what? I actually think that the current environment with the COVID-19, it has really put more impetus to that universality, because it has just exposed how if one country does well and not others, eventually it will impact us all. So almost emphasizing the point that poverty anyway is poverty everywhere, really. So SDG 16 and all the other SDGs really emphasize the need for all countries to realize that you cannot work in isolation. We need to have universal development and leave no one behind. I think COVID-19 is just echoing that message into everyone that no, leave no one behind. You can't just develop your own borders. You can't just develop your own country. You need to have a holistic approach to development for it to be sustainable. Yeah.
Yeah, just to build a little bit on that, I think, I mean, what Judith is saying is completely correct, of course. And I think that the COVID crisis itself has also displayed that no country is immune for shocks and stresses that are coming with this kind of global pandemic crisis upon us. It re-emphasizes the need for all countries to work together to find the solution and not do that in isolation. What you say, Judith, I'm totally in agreement with that. But it also makes us apparently vulnerable in all sectors of the world and in all segments of society. If suddenly this is upon us, it makes you realize that even now, more than ever, making progress on some of these worthy goals as put under the 2030 Agenda is more relevant than ever, of course. Yeah. And also seeing some countries respond in the way they're responding makes me wonder that even more efforts are needed to make that message heard and to bring the message across that, I mean, it's not without nothing that we came up with this agenda, and it's more relevant than ever, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's a really great point about the fact that it's really showing how interconnected we are, how we are in a lot of ways. While we focus a lot on local efforts and local communities, at the same time, we are an interconnected world more than ever. And I think also, on the topic of COVID-19, I mean, I think this crisis has really exposed some of the cracks that were already emerging in a lot of societies and a lot of institutions, and it's only widening those cracks, and I think we're seeing them clearer than ever. And especially when it comes to the response to COVID-19, I think we're seeing varying levels of response and then varying levels of effectiveness in pushing back the virus as well. So one thing that I was also curious about too, from your own perspectives, I mean, when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis, I mean, I think this is, again, presenting many challenges for all of our organizations and all of our partners, both from a programmatic level and from a personal level. So I'm curious to hear from you about what are some of the challenges that you all are facing, or some of your partners are facing, or people in your country are facing, and what do you think? How can we individually and collectively work to overcome some of these challenges?
For me, I think while we talk of inequalities, COVID-19 in a way has put a spotlight to that, just like you said, John. For most of us in the global south, where infrastructure gaps has always been an issue. So COVID-19 caught us unawares. And when now there was the lockdown and everybody was to be forced to be working from home, we found out you can't work from home. You don't have internet. You don't have the infrastructure to support that. So most civil society organizations, we found ourselves in that way where we didn't have a contingency measure for working. So that really impacted on our work. And even the way that we planned our work, most of it, for some of us, like we are into research and policy advocacy. Most of our programs are based on physical interactions, on face-to-face. So suddenly thinking of how do I continue to work and not interact. So people had to think on their toes, but the challenges really were just so glaring. And also, I'm speaking from my experience being in Zimbabwe, where as civil society organizations, we are solely dependent on donor funding. We don't get anything from government. So when COVID-19 came into being, even the donors in the global north were now beginning to re-strategize how, and most of them adopted a wait and see kind of attitude, and they were apprehensive. For example, if the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust were going to have a face-to-face meeting, now they are not. What does it mean for the budget line that made that? So for some, we have actually experienced budget cuts. And because we have no alternative, you find that you are becoming somehow weaker in your operations. So all those kind of challenges, really, I think they are affecting a lot of civil society work. The infrastructure issue, the funding issue, and the innovation. How do you innovate in this kind of environment? Is really such a huge, huge challenge for most of us.
Yeah, thanks, Judith.
Allow me to also build off on what Judith said, and then to also expand a little bit on what we are hearing from our partners in the Global South. We work in over 25 countries in the Global South, predominantly those countries which come out of a conflict situation or are still in a situation where fragility is predominant. what we see indeed as the effects of COVID and the restrictions put in place and the measures taken by the governments of these countries, that it indeed infringes on the operating capacity of civil society. Being forced to work from home, what Judith also says, I mean, has serious impact. People don't have the capacity to have broadband internet connection available, or are depending on not being impacted by fluctuations in the energy supply. And that, which for us maybe in the global north might be something which in a sense is a stable given, it's not everywhere the case. So the operating capacity is impacted. But at the same time, if you look at the response that some of the governments have been given in response to the crisis and the pandemic unfolding, has also seriously impacted, I think, on the space that is given to civil society actors to actually be part of a solution, be part of a process where there's a discussion or a dialogue around how can we potentially respond and how can we potentially react to the crisis unfolding. So what we have been calling for on basis of surveys with our membership and on basis of discussions with members on the ground is that there needs to be a much more inclusive participatory process where civil society actors are indeed being consulted on how it impacts their life, what they see as potential solutions, being at the front line of where the pandemic is unfolding. They are calling for a conflict-sensitive response that takes into account the impact it has and the potential tension it is having in some of the societies around the globe on people being not able to gain an income, so to say. I mean, and that leads to tensions rising in various societies. And all actors trying to come up with a reasonable response should take that into account. And I mean, restrictions, yes, might be needed from a health perspective, but you have to also look at it not only as a health crisis, but it potentially has a broader impact. So you need to look at also the other societal aspects of how the response needs to be tailored in that context.
Yeah, I really agree with that point, Peter, and Johnny have also raised it on the issue of response. For me, I think it even points to the importance of SDG 16 when we talk about strengthening institutions, because what COVID-19 has done is just put on a spotlight on some gaps that as civil society we have been advocating for a long time, that we need universal health coverage, we need to have good infrastructure. And then suddenly, like in my country, we have places in the rural areas which probably the nearest clinic is more than 50 kilometers. And now with the COVID-19, there are efforts now to try and build referral centers should people be found positive, and suddenly people are running around, yet for decades it was ignored. So really the importance of pushing for making sure that institutions are strong, they are responsive, they are accountable has become more important now more than ever, which I think makes working more on Goal 16 even more important during this time.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I completely agree with all that's been said, but I think one thing to add to that as well is, you know, Judith, you alluded to this as well earlier, is that I think the focus of governments in particular now is on the response to a health crisis. And obviously that is the number one priority. We obviously need to address this front and center. But I think the tendency there is then also to ignore some of the systemic issues that we, like you said, Judith, we've been advocating for this for years and decades. So I think making sure that we don't lose sight of the issues around SDG 16 plus. I mean, we know that strong institutions are necessary for responding and rebuilding after this crisis. So my question to you both is, you know, in a few words, what would be your message to governments to make sure that governments are still prioritizing issues and maintaining respect for human rights and doing all of this response in an inclusive way. What's your message to government to make sure that they don't lose sight of SDG 16 plus and the broader 2030 agenda? What would be your message to a government?
I think for me to put people at the center of any initiative, of any policy, because when you do that, you don't then put somebody into a box and say they only have health issues. So you are taking a holistic approach to individuals. So you put citizens, you put your people at the center so that you are addressing all their needs. If you do that, you would then realize that if you put so many dollars just into health and not into building industries that will then offer employment, or into education that will develop our future leaders and all that, then you realize then there's a gap. So for me, really, because my observation is there's a very top-down approach that governments take. When they go down to people, it's only to give them what they've decided, what they think they need, without having involved them. We need a bottom-up approach, maybe both, but mostly a bottom-up approach where you have to listen to the needs of the communities. I see some of the responses and interventions that especially my government is making now with regards to COVID, where during the lockdown, they then said, okay, everything is closed. And okay, we are going to open these sectors, like anything that is agricultural related, we'll open it. But in the manner that they opened, even those people in the informal sector were saying, no, this is not right. You can't look me down and then you say you are opening the market, which is more than the 5 kilometers prescribed in the lockdown restrictions for me to go and get my wares to sell. So if they had involved the people, then they would come up with the right kind of intervention. So really, I think policy without people in it is just void. We need to have people at the center of development.
Just to build on your point, I mean, I cannot agree more that the people-centered approach is needed. And I think that needs to be accompanied with also full and transparent information on what is happening and why a government or any duty bearer is taking certain decisions. And that decision-making process needs to be open and transparent, also to make people understand what the response is and why the response is being tailored in the way that it's being rolled out. You have to take people along in the process. So not only have a focus on the benefit of people and how they are being impacted, whether it's in the healthcare and the health effects of the crisis, but also the secondary effects, which is, in some countries are even bigger already than the health impact in those countries. But at the same time, you have to also bring people along and make them also part of a solution and part of a process where they can add their contribution to finding a common path which leads us out of this situation. That solution orientation needs to be an inclusive process, needs to be a whole of society approach where all factors and all segments of society can contribute, but are also recognized as being part of that solution. So just saying, I mean, short is that the government cannot do it alone. They cannot do the crisis management alone by saying, okay, we shut down the whole process and then everything is solved. I don't think that is for any country a solution. So you have to take certain measures and balance it with also ensuring that people have the means to make their living and have the means to survive, besides surviving from a pandemic which is upon them. And I think that pinpoints what you earlier said to the importance of Goal 16, SDG 16 plus in its widest context, that you have to have responsive institutions that are capable of taking also the viewpoints of other segments of society into account and take them also on board as potential contributors to a solution moving forward.
Great. Yeah. And I think, I think also when it comes to, the response, yes, we know that strong institutions could have prevented a lot of the uptick in cases in a lot of countries. I think what we're seeing is weaker institutions, a weaker institutional response that isn't responsive to the needs of people. I think you're seeing a lot of citizens and societies starting to grow their frustration and discontent. So I think we're starting to see some of the negative impacts of not investing in institutions and infrastructure over the past years and decades, even in some cases. So I think we're starting to see a little bit of that play out now. But as both of you mentioned too, is that when it comes to the rebuilding after the pandemic is over, and then building more resilient societies going forward, I think SDG 16 is a key part of that. Institutional capacity is a key part of that. Ensuring that we have societies that are more responsive and involve people in decision making, I think is huge. So. The next thing that we wanted to talk about and touch on is the 2020 HLPF. So talking about the local context of COVID-19 and the response there. The HLPF, on the other side of things, will look at the global response and how it impacts on sustainable development and the SDGs very broadly. So this year will be a completely virtual format. It'll be much different than HLPFs in the past. So I'm curious to hear from both of you. Both of you have been engaged with the HLPF in the past and previously. So I'm curious about what your expectations are from this meeting, given this new format, and what are you hoping to gain from this year's HLPF?
Actually, for me, I'm more anxious than anything else because while I see the virtual approach giving an opportunity to more people's participation, I also see the challenge of lack of participation, not because people don't want, but because of those inequalities that we have been talking about. Because right now, like we said with COVID and most people now working from home, the inability of people to do that, there's no infrastructure support. So I'm just wondering how many people will be able to follow the proceedings, maybe for the 2 weeks, working virtually, especially from the Global South. That's one challenge that I really see. And also the other one, which is about the time difference. Because for me, all the activities will be happening maybe from afternoon to midnight. And in other parts of the world, I'm sure, I mean, the time differences, for me, I see them as presenting a huge challenge in terms of participation. So I don't know at the moment, I'm anxious. I don't know how much participation I'll be able even to give myself, and let alone other colleagues. So that's where I am with the 2020 HLPF at this stage, yeah. But I'm also hoping that it won't be business as usual, that our governments have been shaken off by the COVID-19. So even the tone of the discussion should be leaning more towards building the resilience as we rebuild after COVID, as hopeful as we are. So I'm hoping that the tone of the HLPF will be more forward-looking, will be more inclusive and more responsive to the needs of the people, yeah.
It's difficult to go after Judith all the time. I mean, she makes the points that I was thinking, well, I could bring these in, but let me try to build on that. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously, I mean, the time zone issue and the capacity of people to actually being able to log on to the virtual meetings themselves with the capacity restrictions they might have in certain countries is a key obstacle, I think, to ensure optimal participation of those who want to be following those meetings. At the same time, I think having everything in a virtual manner also excludes us from the ability to actually have the informal discussions, which are as important as formal settings, meetings where people make presentations. A lot of things from my previous experience in being at the HLPF and being in direct touch with the various stakeholders is that you do business not only in these meetings where people are making presentations, but it's also in the margins that these discussions take place. And that is an important missing element, I think, in the virtual world. At the same time, having everything going virtually, what we have seen with previous meetings happening in the previous months since the pandemic was unfolding, is that you see a huge crowd of people actually attending these meetings, which in a sense seems to give the hint of greater accessibility, but it comes with limitations, I think, in terms of people being able to have their voices heard, and not everybody might be at the level that they come to the forefront and can have a statement made in these settings. The other point I want to make in terms of the HLPF also provides the opportunity to actually look at where countries are in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda through their voluntary national review reports. And what we have seen over the last couple of months in terms of what countries that have volunteered themselves to actually go for review this year have been doing is that process of the preparation for the voluntary national review has been impacted by the COVID crisis as well. So we have seen a less consultative process, less participatory process where obviously face-to-face meetings to have discussions, in-depth discussions about the state of play in a various country settings on the implementation of the agenda has been impacted by COVID restrictions, has not happened, has been done differently, virtually as well, and that has led to an incomplete picture, I would say. And at the same time, some of those countries have started their voluntary national review process potentially after the last HLPF. So they volunteered way ahead before the COVID crisis hit us. So they have been doing the groundwork on taking stock of where they are with the 2030 agenda in terms of implementation, what needs to happen, what the priorities should be, and then suddenly COVID came. And then you have a report which now might not be that relevant anymore because the COVID situation, I think, is impacting also on what governments will now present. So you need addendums, you need to revisit the voluntary national review process, and you actually need to reprioritize and reprogram potentially, given the impact of the COVID crisis. So I see a lot of discussion potentially with all the countries going for review, but there might be an aftermath in saying, okay, yeah, but the COVID crisis is seriously impacting both on the achievement of the agenda, but also on what has been documented as a VNR report that is being presented in New York.
Yeah, and I think, you touched a lot on that just now, Peter, but I think the perpetual challenge for the HLPF is always about how do we make sure that the HLPF doesn't lose, the value of the national level engagement and discussions and the local level. When we bring everything together and aggregate it at the global level, I think sometimes we lose those nuances. And I think that's always been the challenge for the HLPF. I think, as you said, Peter, it'll be more of a challenge this year. I'm also, like Judith said, I'm a mix of anxious and hopeful. I'm hopeful also because because of the HLPF has always been in person, and a lot of efforts haven't really been put into the virtual engagement beyond New York. And I do think, I hope at least, that this will be, a good start. Hopefully it'll set a good precedent for future HLPFs, even if they are hosted in person in New York, I still hope that the virtual engagement will still continue on. But then obviously there's challenges there that we need to work on too. I think also one thing that comes to mind is that in New York, for all of the events and official proceedings, you have translations into the 6 official languages. For virtual events, and this is something that we will likely struggle with as TAP, and I'm sure many of you and your organizations will struggle with as well. But how do we do translation in a live virtual event, for example? It's a lot more difficult to do that digitally. So I think that's also a challenge as well, is that yes, we're being more inclusive with the virtual nature of the HLPF, but still there are still some bottlenecks that we still have to make sure that we're expanding a little bit further to make sure that it's as inclusive as it could possibly be. Just finally, I wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about some of the challenges of the current times with COVID-19, about the HLPF coming up. And there's a lot more information that we'll send out as the TAP network around the HLPF over these next couple of weeks, and much more on COVID-19 over the months ahead. So I'm wondering from each of you, we talked a little bit about why you were motivated to become a TAP steering committee member, but I'm curious to hear from both of you, what are you most looking forward to from the TAP network? From your role as co-chairs, but also from your individual capacity in your own organizations. What are you looking forward to the most going forward from TAP's work?
I think for me, I'm excited about the strategic plan that we have just put across. It carries a lot of potential to build the capacity of civil society from the local level. So I'm hoping that despite COVID-19, we'll find our way around to really fulfill that. There are many interesting things within the strategic plan that I'm really looking forward to seeing them unfolding. So I'm excited to be part of that process. Yeah.
So your answer, Judith, your answer is everything. You're looking forward to everything from the TAP. I think that's a great answer.
Yeah, but maybe I could single out a few things that we are going to be looking at, like the update of the SDG 16 tool, the launching of the Spotlight reporting portal. I think that's really exciting, because I know that civil society organizations in different countries are trying to work around the spotlighting report, but grappling because you don't know the best way to do it. So I really think like this portal, if we launch it, it will be a good resource for civil society organizations, just as one example. But otherwise, almost everything in our strategic plan is exciting.
Good, I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
I think it's good to hear that my fellow co-chair is so excited about the strategic plan, and I join you in that, Judith. But I mean, we are sent as co-chairs of the TAP network starts, of course, in a time that the whole world is being impacted by this crisis, which I think we are still grappling to see the impact and potential long-term impact of it. But I do think that now more than ever, our work and our collective work within the TAP network on SDG 16 is more important than ever. I mean, to make progress at the local level and to actually reinforce the messaging that this is the segue to actually also build better in the future and build forward-looking and more resilient society around the globe. Using SDG 16 plus as a guiding light, so to say. And I think, I mean, in the strategic plan, the membership engagement and bringing partners and members of the TAP network together to join hands and to stand strong, united in a voice to have civil society being seen as an important ingredient and contributor to a pathway towards a more resilient future. I mean, that's what I see as our mission. And whether it's virtual or whether we can indeed meet at one point in time during our stint as co-chairs, I think that is a challenge for us, which we can take up and should take up. So.
And I also do hope that our partners in membership will be able to ride on the opportunity of the blogs series that we have started, because I think that's one way of us being able to tap into each other's experiences. So I'm hoping there will be more uptake for that blog opportunity so we can share information here.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you that I'm looking forward to everything. I think there's a lot there. I mean, I think a lot of this, the strategic plan and everything, really signals that there's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of work that we can do together. So yeah, like both of you have mentioned, I think I'm also looking forward to the improving the collaboration amongst peers and figuring out, especially in this increasingly virtual modality that we're finding ourselves in, of how do we share and learn from one another still digitally, instead of, like Peter mentioned, at the HLPF, where we can have informal conversations on the sidelines of meetings. How do we ensure that we're creating platforms and opportunities, I think, like this conversation here amongst the three of us? How do we make sure that we're unpacking what our colleagues and partners are learning in these challenging times, and then making sure that that spreads all across the network, and that all of our civil society partners can benefit from that. So I think it's a big challenge, but it's one that I know the steering committee has made a top priority. So I'm really looking forward to working with both of you and the steering committee and all of the TAP partners on making this a reality despite the challenging times. So with that, we'll close. There's a lot more that we could obviously say. We can talk for hours, especially on a personal level, knowing both of you quite well. We could be here for hours, but in the meanwhile, again, Judith mentioned the blogs. We'll do more of these. This will be an interview series with TAP partners. So we hope that other colleagues will also express an interest in doing this as well. But again, there's a lot that's happening. We'll be in constant touch with all TAP partners and members. So on my behalf, I'm thankful in advance for everyone's engagement with all of our work going forward. But thanks a lot, Judith and Peter, and looking forward to working with both of you over the next year and a half and maybe longer.
Likewise, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.